Jake Turner, a hard-working farmer in a small rural town, had spent his entire life tending to his land. The farm had been in his family for generations, and he took immense pride in maintaining it. The rolling fields, stretching as far as the eye could see, were his livelihood. Every morning, Jake would wake before sunrise, tending to his crops and livestock with the care only a seasoned farmer could provide. One early morning, as he was making his usual rounds, Jake noticed something unusual: a large black SUV parked right in the middle of his farmland. At first, he thought it might belong to a lost traveler, someone who had taken a wrong turn on the winding dirt roads. But as he approached, he realized there was no one inside. The vehicle sat there, motionless, like an unwelcome guest intruding on his carefully maintained land. His brow furrowed with irritation. The farm was private property, and he couldn't understand why anyone would park there without asking permission. There were no signs of an emergency, no flat tires, no people walking around searching for help. It was simply there, as if it belonged. He waited a while, expecting the owner to return. But as the hours passed and the sun rose higher, no one showed up. It was an odd situation, one that filled Jake with a mix of confusion and frustration. Who would just abandon a vehicle on someone else's property without so much as a note or explanation? Jake wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but he was growing more and more irritated as time went by. He decided to sit on his porch and keep an eye on the SUV while going about his morning chores. His patience wore thin when midday came and went, and the vehicle remained untouched. The truck's presence was not only an inconvenience but also a potential risk. If someone had an emergency, they should have left a sign or tried to contact him. But nothing made sense about the situation. Jake debated whether he should call the sheriff's office, but he knew from past experience that minor property disputes didn't rank high on the priority list. Unless there was immediate danger or evidence of a crime, the response would likely be slow. Instead, he opted for a more direct approach. He wrote a simple note and stuck it on the SUV's windshield. "This is private property. Please remove your vehicle immediately. If left unattended, it will be towed at the owner's expense." With that done, he returned to his work, thinking the problem would soon resolve itself. But as the afternoon stretched into evening, the SUV remained exactly where it was, untouched. No one came to retrieve it, and Jake's patience finally ran out. He had given more than enough time for someone to claim responsibility. The next morning, Jake drove into town to run some errands and decided to ask around about the mysterious vehicle. If someone had broken down or needed assistance, surely word would have spread by now. At the local diner, he struck up a conversation with Sam, the owner and a longtime friend. After mentioning the SUV, Sam's expression shifted to one of understanding. "Ah, that sounds like one of the HOA folks from Ridgeway Hills," Sam said, setting down his coffee cup. "They've been expanding their reach lately, trying to push their rules beyond the neighborhood. Wouldn't be surprised if they're sniffing around your land." Jake's eyes narrowed. Ridgeway Hills was a relatively new, upscale housing development on the outskirts of town. The Homeowners Association, HOA, there had a reputation for being aggressive, often overstepping its boundaries when it came to enforcing rules. But what business did they have on his farm? He had never been part of an HOA, nor had he agreed to any of their regulations. Determined to get to the bottom of the situation, Jake decided to confront whoever was responsible. He needed answers, and he wasn't about to let some self-important HOA official trample over his rights as a landowner. As he drove toward Ridgeway Hills, Jake couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. He had heard stories from other locals about the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. They had been trying to enforce rules beyond their neighborhood, going so far as to claim they had influence over properties that had never been part of their jurisdiction. When he arrived at the Ridgeway Hills community office, he asked to speak to whoever was in charge. A receptionist informed him that Linda Monroe, the head of the HOA, was the one to talk to. After a short wait, he was ushered into her office. Linda Monroe was a middle-aged woman with a sharp, no-nonsense demeanor. She sat behind a large oak desk, her neatly manicured nails tapping against the surface as she regarded Jake with a mix of mild interest and impatience. "Mr. Turner, what can I do for you?" she asked, as if she had already dismissed his concerns before he even spoke. Jake wasted no time getting to the point. "There's an SUV parked on my farm. I asked around, and people seem to think it belongs to someone from the HOA. I want it removed." No. Linda didn't seem the least bit fazed. Instead, she offered a condescending smile. Oh, that vehicle. Yes, it belongs to one of our inspectors. We were conducting a routine survey. Jake's brow furrowed. A survey? Of what? My farm isn't part of your HOA. Linda waved a dismissive hand. Not yet. Ridgeway Hills is expanding, and we've been evaluating the surrounding properties to determine what areas should fall under our governance. Jake felt his temper flare. You can't just waltz onto my land and act like you own the place. That's trespassing. Linda's smile didn't waver. We have authority over land use planning in the area. If your property is deemed suitable for inclusion, we'll discuss next steps. Jake clenched his fists. There won't be any next steps. Move the car and stay off my land. Linda sighed, as if dealing with a stubborn child. I'll see what I can do, but don't expect this to be the last conversation we have about this. Jake stormed out, knowing full well that Linda had no intention of respecting his wishes. This wasn't just about a parked car, it was a power play. By the time Jake returned to his farm, he half expected the SUV to be gone. Instead, it was still there, sitting arrogantly in the same spot. His patience had officially run out. He called the HOA office directly, demanding immediate action. Linda answered, her tone dripping with feigned politeness. Mr. Turner, I'm afraid we're in the middle of other important matters. The vehicle will be removed when it's convenient. Jake gritted his teeth. This isn't a suggestion. I'm giving you 1 hour. Linda's chuckle was low and condescending. Mr. Turner, you don't dictate our schedule. The vehicle stays until we finish our assessment. Jake hung up without another word. It was clear that Linda had no respect for his property rights, and if she wasn't going to listen to reason, he would have to handle things himself. He walked out to his barn, surveying the equipment at his disposal. A slow smile spread across his face as an idea took shape. If Linda thought she could ignore his warnings, she was about to learn a very messy lesson in respecting a farmer's land. Jake, a practical man who doesn't appreciate nonsense, decides to get to the bottom of who owns the SUV. After making several stops in town, including the local feed store, he pieces together the truth. The vehicle belongs to an overreaching homeowners association, HOA, from Willow Creek, which has been bullying homeowners and attempting to exert control beyond its legal jurisdiction. This revelation sparks anger in Jake, who values the independence of rural living. He learns that Linda Monroe, the HOA president, is notorious for her arrogance and controlling nature. Despite knowing he isn't part of the HOA, she acts as if she has the authority to do as she pleases, assuming she can park on his farm without consequences. When Jake finally tracks her down at a fancy cafe, she dismisses his concerns with a condescending wave, suggesting that it's just a farm and she will have someone move the vehicle eventually. Her dismissive attitude only fuels Jake's irritation. When she laughs at his demand to move the car immediately, he decides to teach her a lesson. Jake leaves the cafe, his mind set on dealing with the situation in his own way. When he wakes up the next morning, he finds a second luxury SUV parked right beside the first one. The audacity of the HOA knows no bounds. The situation is no longer just an inconvenience, it's a blatant act of disrespect. Jake immediately calls Linda, demanding that she remove the vehicles. However, Linda remains arrogant, dismissing him as a rural folk who doesn't understand how proper communities operate. She even goes so far as to suggest that he attend to his little crops and stop making a fuss over small things. This blatant condescension pushes Jake past his limit. The HOA has made it clear that they think they can walk all over him, his land, and his way of life. If they won't move their vehicles willingly, then he'll handle it himself. Frustrated, Jake tries calling the local authorities to get the vehicles removed. However, he quickly realizes that the HOA has influence in town. The officials give him a runaround, stating that because his land isn't fenced off, it falls into a gray area. The HOA has been working closely with city officials on zoning issues, and they suggest mediation instead of taking direct action. Jake understands what this means. Nothing will be done. The HOA has connections, and no one wants to step on their toes. It's clear that if he wants this problem solved, he will have to take matters into his own hands. He slips his phone into his pocket and walks toward his barn, a plan forming in his mind. Jake isn't a man to be bullied, and if Linda and her HOA think they can treat his farm like their personal parking lot, they're about to find out how wrong they are. Jake climbs into his farm loader, the engine rumbling beneath him. He drives toward the back of his property, where a massive compost heap of manure has been accumulating for months. The pile is large, steaming, and absolutely foul-smelling, exactly what he needs. With a grin, he lowers the loader's bucket, scooping up an enormous load of the putrid mess. He then maneuvers back toward the SUVs, ensuring that no one is around to witness what's about to happen. With precise timing, he tilts the bucket forward. The first SUV is engulfed in a tidal wave of manure, the thick sludge splattering over the roof, clogging the vents, and coating the windows. He repeats the process with the second SUV, ensuring both vehicles are completely buried up to the door handles in the stinking mess. To finish the job, he plants a wooden sign on top of the pile, painted in bold letters, "Next time, ask for permission." Satisfied with his work, Jake climbs back into his loader and drives away, whistling. Now, all that's left to do is wait. It doesn't take long for the HOA to discover what has happened. Less than an hour later, Jake hears the screech of tires on gravel, followed by the sound of a woman screaming. He steps out of his barn, wiping his hands on a rag as he watches the chaos unfold. Linda Monroe stands in front of the now manure-entombed SUVs, her designer heels sinking into the dirt. Two other HOA board members are with her, their faces twisted in horror at the sight before them. One of them gags from the overwhelming stench, while another covers his nose with his sleeve. Linda, however, is in full meltdown mode. Her face is red with rage as she points a manicured finger at Jake. You did this." Jake tilts his head. "Did what?" She gestures wildly at the steaming pile of manure. "You buried our vehicles in this." Jake shrugs. "Looks like someone parked in a bad spot." One of the HOA board members looks like he might be sick. "You're going to pay for this. We're calling the cops." Jake crosses his arms, letting the silence stretch before responding in a calm, steady voice. "Actually, I can do this. And I have every right to." Linda scoffs. "You think you can get away with this? You're in serious trouble, farmer boy." Jake smirks, pulling out his phone. "Funny thing about that, Linda. I recorded our conversation. You admitted your people parked on my land without permission. That's trespassing." Linda's confident smirk falters as she realizes the gravity of the situation. One of her own board members shifts uncomfortably and mutters, "Linda, he's got a point." Jake steps forward slightly. "Not to mention, I asked you to move the cars, and you refused. This is just farm waste management. If you don't want your cars covered in manure, don't park on my damn property." Linda's face goes pale as the reality of the situation sinks in. Her arrogance has finally caught up to her. But Jake knows this isn't over yet. People like Linda never go down without a fight. And sure enough, she screeches, "I'll have my lawyer on the phone in 5 minutes." Jake chuckles. "Go ahead. Call them. While you're at it, why don't you call the news too?" He points upward, and the HOA members follow his gaze. Hovering just above them is a drone, its camera lens gleaming in the sunlight. Jake grins. Looks like the whole town is about to see this mess. The HOA believed that their influence in town, coupled with legal gray areas, would force Jake to comply. They assumed that he would be powerless against their tactics, given that the local authorities seemed hesitant to intervene. Linda Monroe, the HOA president, viewed Jake as just another farmer who could be intimidated into submission. What they failed to realize was that Jake was not someone who backed down easily. He was patient, observant, and, most importantly, determined to defend his rights. Instead of reacting impulsively, Jake strategically assessed the situation. He sought legal advice from a friend who specialized in property law and confirmed that the HOA had no legal claim over his land. He also took the time to gather evidence, recording conversations, taking pictures, and even reaching out to local news stations. The more he learned about the HOA's overreach, the more determined he became to expose them. This was no longer just about an SUV parked on his farm. This was about standing up to a group that had bullied people for too long. Jake wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for his town. As Jake's story started to spread, people in town took notice. Many homeowners had experienced similar run-ins with the HOA but had felt powerless to resist. Linda Monroe and her board members had built a reputation for issuing arbitrary fines, enforcing unreasonable rules, and expanding their authority beyond what was legally permissible. When Jake took a stand, it was as if he had given the community permission to push back. Social media buzzed with support. Neighbors stopped by his farm to offer words of encouragement. Some shared their own stories of how the HOA had wronged them, unjust fines, threats of foreclosure, and demands that went beyond the limits of their jurisdiction. The more people spoke out, the more pressure the HOA faced. Local news outlets began investigating, uncovering years of questionable practices. Linda, once feared as an untouchable authority, found herself at the center of growing public outrage. The support for Jake became a movement, and suddenly, the HOA was on the defensive. Realizing that she was losing control, Linda Monroe attempted to shift the narrative. She portrayed Jake as a reckless troublemaker who had no respect for authority. In a hastily arranged press conference, she accused him of endangering the community, calling his actions an attack on the very foundation of good neighborhood governance. Her words, however, did little to sway public opinion. The video evidence Jake had gathered, her dismissive attitude, the blatant trespassing, and her refusal to move the cars, painted a different picture. Every time Linda spoke, the footage was shared again, countering her claims and reinforcing the truth. To make matters worse, several members of the HOA board, sensing the shift in public sentiment, began distancing themselves from Linda. Some quietly resigned, while others outright condemned her leadership. The once feared HOA president was now viewed as a liability, and the cracks in her authority widened by the day. As complaints against the HOA mounted, local officials could no longer ignore the situation. A formal investigation was launched, revealing multiple violations committed under Linda's leadership. Records showed that she had misused HOA funds, enforced rules without legal backing, and even forged documents to justify expanding the HOA's control over non-member properties. The fraudulent paperwork was the final nail in the coffin. Linda had been using fake documentation to claim jurisdiction over properties that were never part of the HOA's official charter. This included Jake's farm, as well as several other properties she had attempted to regulate. When the authorities finally stepped in, Linda found herself facing real consequences. Charges were filed against her, and she was ordered to step down immediately. The remaining HOA board members scrambled to salvage what they could, offering settlements to affected homeowners and promising to reform their practices. But for many, it was too little, too late. The damage had been done, and the trust was broken. With Linda removed from power and the HOA facing serious scrutiny, Jake's battle was finally over. He had not only defended his land but had also played a key role in exposing corruption and protecting his community from further exploitation. To celebrate, Jake decided to host a neighborhood barbecue, inviting everyone who had supported him. The turnout was massive. People brought food, shared stories, and enjoyed an evening of laughter and camaraderie. It wasn't just a party, it was a statement. The people had taken back control, and they weren't going to let another HOA bully push them around again. As Jake raised a toast, he looked out at his land, now free from unwanted SUVs and power-hungry officials. He had stood his ground, and in doing so, he had shown everyone that sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to fight back in a way they never see coming. And if every now and then he passed by the sign he had planted, next time ask for permission, and chuckled to himself, well, who could blame him? Despite her downfall, Linda couldn't let go of her grudge against Jake. A few weeks after stepping down as HOA president, she was spotted lingering near the edge of Jake's property, her once pristine appearance replaced with a frazzled, desperate look. She sat in an old beat-up sedan, far from the luxury SUVs she used to flaunt, glaring at his farm as if plotting one last act of petty revenge. Jake noticed her presence but didn't react immediately. He knew people like Linda didn't just give up. That evening, as Jake sat on his porch enjoying the cool breeze, he saw flashing blue and red lights approaching. 2 police patrol cars rolled up behind Linda's vehicle, blocking her in. As soon as the officers stepped out, their flashlights trained on her, Linda frantically grabbed her phone, her expression turning from scheming to panicked. "Ma'am, step out of the vehicle," one of the officers said firmly. Jake leaned against his porch railing, smirking as he watched the scene unfold. He already had a good idea of what was happening. After all, Linda had tried to file a harassment complaint against him, claiming that he had threatened her and destroyed her property. She must have thought that by showing up near his farm, she could gather some sort of evidence to support her false claims. But Linda had underestimated just how deep her own corruption ran, and how much the authorities had been looking into her. The officers, having already investigated her complaint, found something far worse: fraudulent HOA paperwork. Turns out, Linda had been faking HOA jurisdiction over properties that had never legally been part of it, including Jake's land. The police had been waiting for a reason to bring her in, and she had just handed it to them on a silver platter. "You have no right to do this to me," Linda screeched as the officers placed her in handcuffs. "I am a respected community leader. This is all a misunderstanding." Jake let out a low chuckle and tipped his hat to the officers. "Appreciate the help, officers." One of the cops nodded. "I think this is the last time she'll be bothering you." Jake watched as Linda was shoved into the back of the patrol car, still shrieking about injustice and mistakes. But he simply turned, walked back to his porch, and whistled a little tune to himself, enjoying the quiet victory. Linda's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The once feared HOA queen had fallen from grace in the most public way possible, and people weren't about to let her off the hook. News spread quickly about her fraudulent activities, and suddenly, everyone who had ever been wronged by her was coming forward with their own horror stories. Local news stations covered the scandal in depth. Homeowners who had been fined for trivial reasons spoke out about her overreach. Business owners who had faced harassment from her power-hungry antics shared their frustrations. Even members of her former HOA board, eager to save their own reputations, began testifying against her, claiming they had no idea the extent of her fraudulent activities. But the worst blow came when the mayor announced a full-blown investigation into the Willow Creek HOA. With mounting pressure from both the public and local government, the HOA was forced to review its policies, suspend several board members, and issue refunds for unjust fines. Their reputation was in tatters, and their influence was permanently crippled. Linda herself faced multiple charges, including fraud, illegal property claims, and harassment. The once powerful woman who had dictated how people should live their lives now had her own future dictated by a judge. She fought tooth and nail to avoid jail time, but in the end, she was convicted and sentenced to community service, fines, and a public record that would forever mark her as a fraud. For Jake, the entire ordeal served as validation. He had stood his ground, refused to be bullied, and in doing so, had exposed the corruption that had plagued his town for too long. His actions had not only protected his own property but had also liberated his neighbors from Linda's tyranny. With Linda out of the picture and the HOA's power significantly diminished, Jake's farm finally returned to what it had always been, a place of peace and hard work, free from unnecessary interference. He took down the temporary barriers he had set up to keep intruders out, but he left one thing standing: the large wooden sign near the entrance of his property that read, "Next time, ask for permission." Every time he passed by it, he couldn't help but chuckle to himself. It was a simple reminder that his land belonged to him, and no clipboard-wielding tyrant would ever change that. The town, once on edge due to the HOA's aggressive tactics, also breathed a sigh of relief. Homeowners painted their houses whatever color they pleased. Farmers continued their work without worrying about some out-of-touch committee trying to enforce ridiculous regulations. And most importantly, people learned that standing up for themselves against overreach was not only possible, it was necessary. Jake continued his work, enjoying the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had made a real difference. And if anyone ever dared to test him again, well, he still had plenty of manure ready to go. To celebrate the town's newfound freedom, Jake decided to throw a massive neighborhood barbecue. Using part of the $22,000 payout the HOA had given him as compensation, he spared no expense. People from all over town showed up, including those who had suffered under Linda's reign. There was live music, slow-smoked brisket, cold beer, and a whole lot of laughter. Stories were exchanged, and the highlight of the evening was the many jokes made at Linda's expense. Jake stood up, raising a toast as the sun set over his land. To good neighbors, bad HOAs, and knowing when to stand your ground. The crowd erupted in cheers, clinking their drinks together in celebration. It was a night to remember, not just as a party, but as a moment of victory for every person who had ever been pushed around by an overreaching HOA. For Jake, it wasn't about revenge. It was about principle. And that night, he knew one thing for sure. He had done the right thing. In the months that followed, the remnants of the corrupt HOA faded into irrelevance. New leadership was put in place, but their influence was a shadow of what it had once been. The town had learned its lesson. No one would ever let an HOA overreach like that again. As for Linda, she was long gone. After her arrest and public humiliation, she sold her house and moved 3 towns over, where she hopefully learned to keep her nose out of other people's business. Jake, on the other hand, kept living the way he always had, on his own terms. His farm thrived, his land remained his own, and life was peaceful once again. And if anyone ever dared to cross him again, well, he still had plenty of manure left over.